Ukrainian drones killed 3 people in Moscow. So what? Their drunk drivers hit and kill significantly more people every day. But it turns out this could affect the course of the war. In the Middle East, 3 drones targeted a nuclear reactor. 2 were shot down, but 1 got through. And this fundamentally changes the situation on the planet. Why does it change things? We'll tell you and show you. We have an absolutely fascinating story for you. Cubans took part in Russia's war against Ukraine and upon returning brought back 300 drones. And they hid them near the American base. You may have noticed that in all these stories, the very same drones are involved. The ones Zaluzhny said have changed the tactics and strategy of wars. Let's talk about all of this, but let's start with Moscow and the shock. Women still haven't recovered from it after a whole day. Residents of the Russian Federation, no matter where they are, no matter how close or far they are from Moscow. What was happening there is now happening here. On the night of May 17, Ukraine launched more than 500 drones toward Russia. Russia's air defense claimed to have shot down 556. Of course, this number is more about boasting than arithmetic, but the scale is clear. In Moscow and the Moscow region, 3 people were killed and about a dozen were wounded, as usual. The main strike was at the entrance to the refinery in Kapotnya, I think it's called. Sobyanin announced on Telegram half an hour later that the plant's processing facilities was not damaged. He had to say this phrase because at that very moment, the same question started popping up in every Moscow chat. What if they had hit it? A drone was shot down, right? Right over Sheremetyevo. Debris fell on the airfield. Flights were not delayed because they were lucky. Not because Russia is protected, but because they were lucky. This is the first long-range massive attack of such scale on the Moscow region during the entire war. The drones flew over 500 kilometers. This is a qualitative, exceptional leap, not just a quantitative one. What does a person in Moscow feel? What is a person in Moscow feeling right now? For more than 3 years of war, for a resident of the capital, it was, let's put it this way, a television abstraction. Let's call it that. War correspondence on the screen, some parades, some ritual reports, and most importantly, everything is calm here. Everything is absolutely calm here. That was the core of the agreement with the Kremlin. It means you don't object publicly, and we leave you alone. The war is somewhere out there. The sirens are somewhere over there, with them, not with us. That agreement has collapsed. On the night of May 17th. Not because 3 people died, 100 times more die on Moscow's roads in a year, but because for the first time you can't turn away from the war. The smell of burning, the siren. A message in the school chat. If an alert is announced, we go down to the basement, in the school chat. The word basement in Moscow in May of 26. In the parents' chat for a 5th grade class. This is a turning point, not because a Muscovite got scared, but because the government's promise of protection turned out to be just rhetoric. 4 shifts. The first, war has stopped being a television series. A series has a remote control, but war doesn't have a remote control. The second, the image of the authorities as protectors is falling apart. Every morning our air defense shoots something down. This many, that many, right? So that's an admission. It means they're getting through. Third, silence is no longer the norm, and it has become a privilege. Fourth, the most destructive. It's the divide between those who are protected and those who are not. Now, there's not just a hierarchy of wealth, but a hierarchy of security, too. It's a divide that the Kremlin does not control. What can Putin do? Well, honestly, any options I see are bad. Bad for Putin. The first one, a massive retaliatory strike, say, on Kyiv. It's familiar and clear. Ukraine adapted, but Moscow did not. Psychologically, it's one experience of fear against another, right? But only Russia is losing because Russians had little or no fear. Each new blow hits harder. The second escalation might be towards NATO. Yes, over there. Now we'll show them what we've got. Yes, tactical, nuclear, or a strike on Western infrastructure. Well, something like that. Yes, crazy, suicidal. And Putin knows this very well. Of course, the temptation is there. Only that would have brought back the image of being all-powerful. Something like that. Yes, and the price of becoming a target for the coalition. Third, internal tightening of the screws. What's it called, right? Nut welding, tightening, yes. Martial law for Moscow, internet shutdown, enemy agents everywhere will make Russia look like North Korea, right? One step, another step, another step. Putin actually likes it, yes, but the metropolitan class won't forgive this. Because that's the metropolitan class. And the fourth, negotiations. Yes, the most sober, that's why it's the most unlikely. To admit that the country can no longer be protected from the swarm of cheap drones means to admit that 3 years of war have led nowhere, with all the sacrifices. Putin won't be able to say that. It's the end of his legitimacy. Most likely we'll see a mix of the first and third, retaliatory strikes and quiet tightening of the screws. Tightening the screws at the same time as twisting the guts. Fundamentally, this won't solve anything. Drones are cheap. There are many of them. They will keep reaching their targets, farther and farther, more and more accurately. Nuclear chapter. A strike on Baraka. Well, technically it failed. Yes, I understand. Yes, they hit the electric generator. Outside the perimeter, the reactor is operating normally. By news standards, it's not news, but by historical standards. Gentlemen, this is the news of the century. For the first time in documented history, a drone has deliberately attacked an operating civilian nuclear power plant. Previously, this nuclear infrastructure was considered beyond the scope of ordinary wars. You can't strike it without turning a local conflict into a global catastrophe. But now it turns out you can, and it's also very cheap. No signature, through an intermediary, with plausible deniability. We would never do this. It was someone else. The main thing is this was done during a so-called truce. Since April 8th, there's been a ceasefire between the US and Iran. A strike. A strike is a signal to the whole world. I have a card in my pocket that you won't be able to beat. This card is the threat of a nuclear disaster on foreign territory. And, oh, not by our hands. Someone else struck. And there really is nothing that can beat it. Well, unless the West fully occupies Iran and wipes out Iran's drone industry, which it won't, there's no answer to it. And the most important thing, if Iran has this card, anyone could have it tomorrow. The Houthis, Hezbollah, a group in the Sahel, a cartel in Latin America, which managed to scrape together $500,000 for a batch of drones. Easily. The state's monopoly on destructive violence is over. Here we have reached the point that everyone was talking about. We used to imagine that bandits, gangsters, or whatever else you call them, terrorists, had a nuclear bomb. It turns out you don't even need that. All they need is just a drone that can fly somewhere. And when that happened, classical international law collapsed. It was built on the assumption that destruction has a return address. And you could strike back at that return address, but it turned out you could do it differently, that you don't have to have it. Cuba in 1962 is not the same as Cuba in 2026. The third picture is a Dutch warehouse, 300 drones. All the studios are talking about Cuban Missile Crisis 2.0. And that's a dangerous comparison because it pushes us to repeat the decisions of 1962, which won't work today. The nature of the weapons. Back then, nuclear missiles were as long as, well, a 12-story building apparently, and it was impossible to fake them even from a satellite. And now there are 300 drones each, about the size of, at most, a compact car. They can be disassembled and hidden in basements, garages, storage rooms, and satellites can't detect them. So the supply channel. Back then, there was one supplier, one route by sea. Kennedy imposed a blockade and the channel was shut down within a week. Now there are two suppliers, Russia and Iran. And the routes go through Venezuela, through Nicaragua, through Panamanian intermediaries, the return of Cuban mercenaries, however you want to call it. Back then, it was nuclear apocalypse. There was blackmail, right? That brought both sides together around a compromise. Now it's a pinpoint strike on a frigate, on the West Warehouse, on an oil terminal in Florida. Not an apocalypse, no. Just a jab, but a very painful one. It's hard to respond to a painful jab with a nuclear triad. Well, you won't drop atomic bombs after 3 drones fly from Cuba. The The blackmailer is getting bolder and bolder. Back then, no one doubted whose missiles those were. Now the drones are on Cuban soil, but they're jointly produced, brought in through intermediaries in the personal luggage of volunteers. Where will the first one fly? Who will be to blame? Nothing is clear. Formally, the blame is on Cuba. Well, probably through Moscow, but you're thinking Tehran, maybe technologically. There's no point in hitting a decoy, is there? Back then, Khrushchev ruled with a monolithic apparatus. Now Cuba is in economic collapse. Maduro is on the edge. In Iran, there are succession problems. Well, after Khamenei, Putin has Moscow being bombed. All blackmailers are both weak and dangerous at the same time. The most dangerous thing is a rat that's been cornered. Trump is right about that. American defense can no longer begin at the U.S. border when weapons of mass terror cost tens of thousands, not billions. The concept of defense as border protection, is 100% outdated. It is being replaced by a new logic, a 2,000-mile perimeter around the continental United States. Well, let's say, for example, Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, Haiti, any Caribbean allies of hostile powers. These are not foreign affairs. This is top-level national security. Once again, this is not our business. Now it has become our business. No significant arsenals of hostile systems should exist along this arc. Not under supervision, not within the framework of international law. They simply should not exist. Period. Military intelligence, satellite surveillance, sabotage teams, diplomatic pressure, sanctions. Well, it all has to happen at the same time. And it shouldn't just be a reaction to some incident, because the incident could turn out to be devastating. Absolutely devastating. It's a constant state. Of course, it sounds shocking to a well-bred liberal from the State Department. It violates the formulas of respect for sovereignty. I understand this clearly, right? I was a libertarian myself, at least. The reality is simple. Either the U.S. establishes such a perimeter, like right now, with minimal intervention, or they get a perimeter that is established by a strike in a few years. It's better to do it now. With minimal intervention, rather than after a catastrophe. And the main libertarian question, does this expanded perimeter contradict the philosophy and freedom? At first glance, yes. It's their country. It's their right, isn't it? But in reality, excuse me, gentlemen, actually, no. Protection of life. Well, what, let's say, Galambus called primary property. Primary property. Life, body, life, body. The only purpose for which the state can be tolerated. When protecting life requires an expanded perimeter, the perimeter expands. So let's say in Jewish philosophy, in Jewish wisdom, there is this, I've already mentioned this, there is a phrase, pikuach nefesh, that is, pikuach nefesh, meaning saving a soul. Yes, like saving a life, if we speak in Hebrew, right? It overrides everything, even Shabbat, right? It's a sacred thing. On Shabbat, doing certain things, everything is overridden. Go and save a life. Period. What connects all these 3 points we've talked about? So Baraka, Moscow, Havana. What do they have in common? Asymmetry. The attacker spends 100 or 200 times less than the defender. A Ukrainian drone costs tens of thousands. The system that shoots it down, like the Panzer, costs millions. An Iranian drone. So in Baraka, that's 20, maybe 50,000 at most. But the Emirati air defense system costs tens of millions. A Cuban drone costs 20,000. The American defensive infrastructure costs billions. So this cost dynamic has no long-term solution because the one who defends themselves goes bankrupt. 3 people killed in Moscow is statistically nothing. But they changed their behavior because of it. The population is affected more than by 1,000 deaths in the provinces because people died where death shouldn't happen. Here, in Moscow. That can't be, right? This is the capital. This is the very center. They reached us. What does it mean they reached us? That they might reach us again tomorrow? The burned-out generator at, let's say, NPP, the nuclear power plant's generator. Hydroelectric power station, nuclear power plant, 0 damage, 0, nothing, right? But it changes the picture. Risk. The risk to the oil market is greater than an attack on 10 tankers, 300 drones in Cuba. Not a single one has flown anywhere yet. And if it takes off, maybe we'll blow them all to hell right away. But they're already shaking up the entire American strategy. They're completely changing our strategic doctrine. Years ago, the world was like a pyramid, right? Great powers, medium and small ones, and non-state actors, as they called them, right? The atomic bomb strengthened the pyramid, but the drone wiped it out. The Houthis, who have neither a fleet nor a capital nor money, shut down a global shipping channel. Corridor. More than just a channel. What has to happen for this to stop being shocking? There are 3 questions for the world. 3 questions for the world. First, how will Putin respond now that the war has reached Muscovites' bedrooms? He will try not to let it in there through an information blockade. He'll lose because telegram turbine noise and the smell of burning from the window outweigh Solovyov. And even a reinforced one, all of his, what are they called, second. Will the Americans agree, especially the part that is still considered libertarian or some kind of liberal, to a 2,000-mile corridor? I think they will agree. When the first Georgian, the first Cuban drone reaches Miami, it would be better if they agreed earlier, before that, of course. But I'm afraid we need to be taught if we only learn when something blows up here, or when someone dies, or when we get punched in the face. Freedom requires defending the boundaries of its existence. Pikuach nefesh. They do not contradict freedom. It protects freedom. And now the third most important thing. Do we even see that this is a new world order and not just isolated incidents? Most strategists don't see it, by the way. Moscow is just an episode of the Ukrainian war. Baraka is an episode of the Iranian storyline. Cuba is an episode of Latin American politics. But this, ladies and gentlemen, is a single episode. And it needs to be understood, and it has a name, Cuba. The state stops protecting the citizen because technology has outpaced institutions. That's why, whether the leaders of the free world see this now or in 10 years on the ruins of something, it doesn't matter. It depends on who we will be, people who inherited freedom or people who lost it without even noticing how it slipped away. Moscow, 5 stages. Editor. Kubler-Ross described 5 stages of accepting the inevitable for a dying person. A society under prolonged stress behaves in a similar way, with some caveats, of course, but very much like an individual. Shock. May-June. Warning sirens. A barrage of news in the mornings, conversations in taxis. Did you hear? In Capitano, right? There you go, a loud and brief shock. The psyche can't handle it. People adapt to prolonged acute anxiety after 4 to 6 weeks. By the end of June, the sirens will feel as ordinary as a tram. And it's annoying, but, well, what can you do? It's on, it's on. It's become, so to speak, part of the background of our lives. Then comes July and August. Let's call it theatricalization. Maybe as someone from the theater I like this word, but listen for yourself. Summer is traditionally a season for putting on a show. Everything is as usual. For us, everything is as usual. Cafes on Nikolskaya, VDNH. This is the first defensive reaction of the masses. As long as I behave as if everything is normal, children retain a sense of normalcy. The authorities will be there. They will encourage it. Big festivals, an extended city day, fireworks. Underneath all the theatrics, internal fatigue is building up. By the end of August, Muscovites will find themselves with a chronic feeling of not having gotten enough sleep. Even though they sleep as usual, it's just nerves. Next, September-October. With the slush came irritation. Schools are opening. Everyday irritation begins. The canceled commuter train. Turns out debris had fallen, a delayed flight, a product missing from the supermarket because of Ukrainian strikes on the oil refinery. At that point, the irritation isn't political, it's just everyday aggravation. That's why it's the most dangerous thing for the regime. It doesn't have an addressee, not Putin personally. That's off limits, of course. But for us in general, actually, things have just started working less well. The formula can't be disproved or banned. That was also the first wave of what's called internal emigration, not leaving the country. Well, most of those who wanted to left in 22, 23, 24. And turning to work, to family, home repair YouTube videos, TV series. In other words, the main way the Soviet intelligentsia survived from 68 to 91 like that, it will come back. November, December. Cold weather. The most dangerous and most important stage. By December, there will be severe frosts. If Ukraine continues to strike at Russian energy infrastructure, it will continue. Every disruption with heat, electricity, or gas will be seen as, well, not a technical problem at all, as a violation of a fundamental agreement. As I already said, the agreement is simple. I stay silent and you provide us with heat. I stay silent and you provide us with security. When there is no heat, the agreement is terminated. A quiet reconsideration begins inside a person's mind. What was the point of me staying silent all these years? That is what coldness is. Not degrees, it's a psychological chill. Well, and then January and beyond. Let's call it a joke. At the coldest point of winter, something is born that Russian culture knows better than anyone else. A joke. It's not a joke. It's not satire. It's a short, bitter form in which reality is exposed. Don't call it by name. By January, there will be 34 jokes in Moscow that everyone will know. About air defense, about Putin, about Ukrainian engineers who know where our light bulbs are. A joke in an authoritarian system is a safety valve. It's a signal from the bottom to the top, and it passes by the censors because it has no author. When a joke reaches the authorities, and it always does, the authorities see that people have stopped fearing them from within. Why do you think Stalin gave everyone 10 years in prison for telling a joke? This is the real shift between May 2026 and January 2027. Not a revolution, not a riot, not taking to the streets. It's simply the loss of inner fear. From that moment on, the entire movement of the system depends only on the resources for coercion and not on authority. That's what the Kremlin will try to do, and why it won't be enough. Moscow's information defense. Censorship, slowing down YouTube, pressure on bloggers. The long-term effect is zero. People already know how to use VPNs, and a negative atmosphere has already been created. Bonuses will be given to public sector employees, pension increases. Moscow is a special case. It worked while Moscow was mandatory. Money without a sense of security loses at least half its power. The collective West will be added to Ukraine. The liberal fifth column. There must always be an enemy within. Yes, we've been through this many, many times. It works for 12 cycles. By the third, the audience turns away. The Kremlin will need a major success by New Year's. The problem is there's no breakthrough at the front, and it looks like there won't be one. And in a drone war, there is no front in the classical sense. The most likely scenario is they'll find a mole. They'll show him, there he is. Because of him or because of them, everything didn't work out for us. They'll punish them as an example. So, well, it'll let off some steam. So that's the personification of failure. The second time, the public will start to think, what if he's a mole? Why was he in such a high-ranking position? All 5 answers just delay things. They don't stop the downward movement. By January 2027, the woman from Moscow from the premiere will still end up at that point, liking the teacher's messages, and without the energy to change anything. In Russia, revolutions aren't made in the streets. Where are they made? If they're made, it's in the kitchens. February 1917. No one went to defend the Tsar. August 1991. No one went to defend the State Emergency Committee, except for maybe 100 enthusiasts. December of that same 1991, millions of Soviet citizens didn't lift a finger to defend the country they were born in.
Российский.
The Russian political transition works according to a formula. First, the feeling goes away, and then the power goes away. By January 2027, the feeling will be greatly undermined. It's not time for a change of power yet. For that, 1 or 2 more crises are needed. But reaching the point of exhaustion, I think, is certain. Exhaustion is the end of the Putin era, not a physical end, a psychological one. When the country stops believing that Putin decides anything, he stops deciding anything, even if he's still sitting in the Kremlin. Well, this happened with Brezhnev. Yes, around 1980 to 1982, it will happen again. What does this mean for us, for you, me, and the free world? Russia, within 1 or 2 years, will be in a state of controlled paralysis. Neither a super adversary nor a partner. A huge, painfully exhausted entity behaving badly in predictable ways, but less and less effectively. This creates 2 windows, a diplomatic solution for Ukraine by the end of the winter of 1926-1927, and a direct conversation with Russian society, bypassing the Kremlin. When internal emigration becomes widespread. Once again, internal emigration. Kyiv from May to January. The same 8 months, the other side, a completely different dynamic. Confidence beginning to crack. But that's May-June, the attack on Moscow on May 17. The first truly major long-range strike against the enemy's capital. Psychologically, we are acting, not just enduring. After 3 years of mostly defensive war, there was a sense of our own latent power and significance in the Ukrainian air. Not that someone will help us, not that we will just hold on, but we got to them. Beneath the confidence, there's deep fatigue. Draft officials are rounding up men in shops and cafes. Guys are fleeing to Poland and the Czech Republic. Funerals are daily. It's not just military news, it's your neighbor, your classmate. July, August. The first summer. If anyone knows what a first victory is, it's harder than 2022, 2022, 2024. The Ukrainian army has reached its demographic ceiling. 30 million remain inside. They can't. Endlessly sending 20,000 to 30,000 new recruits to the front each month is impossible. As many as are being killed need to be replaced. A tactical window will appear. So Russia is focused on Moscow. There will be local victories, but strategically the front line won't shift drastically. For every square mile, several funeral buses will go to small towns in the west. By the end of August, a topic that couldn't be mentioned before will come up, and what should be considered a victory. To take back Crimea by military means? I hope it becomes clear it's impossible. Donbass at a price that isn't unjustified for those who remain alive. September, October. The return, let's call it, of the dark question. Or maybe really negotiations. In May 2024, it was betrayal. In May 2025, it was weakness. In May 2026, it is not spoken of. In October, people will be saying the opposite, in kitchens. In January 2027, in studios. It doesn't mean that negotiations will take place. It means that the psychological ban on discussing them will dissolve. In a democracy, public acceptability of a topic comes before a political decision, usually about 6 to 12 months later. November, December. Cold, cold. Just like in Russia, but it's a cold you have to endure. Russia will strike at Ukrainian energy infrastructure on a larger scale. They need to take revenge for May. The blackout schedule in Kyiv, Kharkiv, Odessa. Generators are more expensive than used cars. Schools are operating in hybrid mode. And most importantly, Ukrainians have already been through this. The winters of 2022 to 2023, 2023 to 2024, and 2024 to 2025. The skill has been acquired. This is psychological muscle. It doesn't make winter any easier, but it makes it bearable. We already know it will pass. There will also be a bitter, steady pride. We've seen this before, and we're seeing it again, and we'll get through it. The Ukrainian military meme is different from the Moscow joke. A joke is a protest against authority from the underground. A meme is taming fear through laughter. A joke says our authorities are a laughingstock, but a meme says our fear is manageable. By December, several new memes will spread across social media. Cruel. Accurate. a functional way to collectively experience fear without a collective psychological breakdown. January 2027. We've reached this point. Recognition. From the French word reconnaissance. At the same time, it means acknowledgement and scouting. So, reconnaissance, probably, that's how we say it in American English. Acknowledgement that the war will not be won in the sense of returning to 1991. And scouting out the new situation. A very painful moment. Not a defeat. Growing up. Ukraine will enter the winter as a country ready to talk about the war on its own terms, not in terms of all or nothing. By January 2027, a serious discussion about compromise will begin, not capitulation, a way out. Freezing the front line at current positions with international guarantees, no legal recognition of Russian annexations, maximum compensation and reconstruction with Western involvement. The path to the EU is open, the path to NATO is not. That's a separate, complicated issue. Abandoning attempts to liberate the occupied territories by force in exchange for de jure Ukrainian status and the right to regain them someday through a peaceful settlement, not a victory. Stopping the bleeding, not a defeat. Preserving statehood, language, culture, democracy at 80%? I don't know. That's 78% of Russia, pre-war Ukraine. Well, let's think about the parallels and contrasts, right? Moscow, May, January, confidence. Confidence, then irritation, then internal emigration, then a joke, then breaking the contract with the authorities. Kyiv, May, until January. Confidence with cracks showing. Of the first summer. Return of the dark question, the cold of endurance. Recognition. Moscow is losing its sense of normalcy. The city has lived for years under a special security regime. The regime is over, and a Muscovite doesn't have the psychological tools to live in instability. The reaction, refusal to participate, withdrawal. Kyiv has been living in instability for 4 years already. The toolkit is assembled. Every step is not from normal to abnormal, but within the abnormal. Reaction, adaptation, plus a reduction of illusions. The picture becomes more complex. Moscow is losing its will. Kyiv is losing its illusions. These are very different losses. Moscow is growing quieter. Muscovites speak less about the war in public and trust television less. They'll identify less with the state, leading to silent failure. Kyiv is moving toward an agreement. A Ukrainian will talk more and more about the war in public. They will cling less and less to the dogmatic formulas of 1922. They will negotiate with reality more and more. It's a path to a difficult, painful, but achievable and possible compromise. These are opposite trajectories, and this is the main strategic opportunity for the West in the winter of 2026 to 2027. What does this mean for the free world? By January, in both capitals, the mood will be ready for compromise, for different reasons. In Moscow, because they are tired and don't believe anymore. In Kyiv, because they have understood the cost and want to survive. These two moods, meeting at the negotiating table with the right mediator. Well, the right mediator most likely, I hope, will be the Trump administration. There simply isn't anyone else. They can provide the first real window to end the war since 2022 ending, not victory for either side. But a halt to the active phase, a freeze with a multi-year. A process, let's call it a peace process, which will not end completely. As long as this regime rules in Moscow, but it will be possible to exit the hot phase. And this will be, well, as it seems to me, by 2026 or 2027, an outcome that will make all of us proud. For this, the West will not waver. Until both curves cross the point of readiness, premature pressure on either side is a failure. Trump will play the role of a tough and ruthless mediator, putting pressure on both sides at the same time. He already showed this with Iran in the winter of 25-26. Europe, it seems, will be building the reconstruction infrastructure, which will be waiting for the moment the fighting stops, not Putin's help, after, but a force that accelerates the decision to pause. Because Ukrainians will see that there's not just emptiness there, but actually a plan. It even seems like a serious plan. 2 clockwork mechanisms. Returning to the 2 women. In Moscow and in Kyiv, who were watching everything happening there on May 17, 2026, holding their sons by the hand. By January 2027, one of them will have forgotten how to believe in the promises of the authorities. The other will learn to hear complexity in her own voice, which hadn't made itself heard before. For the first, it will be a loss, and for the second, a gain. Both will come to the same place, to a conversation about bringing it to an end. But they will come from different sides, and both will be exhausted, one by cynicism, the other by maturity. This, in fact, is the drama of the whole winter. That's 26-27. Not in military maneuvers, not in drone strikes, but in the ticking of 2 psychological clocks, which converge at one point in 8 months. The one who sees and hears these 2 clock mechanisms can do something. The one who only listens to the news will miss the most important event of the decade, maybe even the century. And here's a final question. In December 1916, European diplomats also thought they were hearing everything important. Gunshots, reports from the front lines, casualties, diplomatic notes. There was only one thing they didn't hear: 2 ticking sounds inside St. Petersburg and Berlin. And when the hands met, the world they were used to living in collapsed, ladies and gentlemen, in a second. If you found this useful, then on Roadmap to Freedom, that's a separate channel, there are specific steps. How to read political dynamics, not by the news, but by what is really happening inside those news stories. See you tomorrow. Until next time.